"Get back on that stage," he said. "This place isn't what the advertisement said it was." Ruth didn't move. She looked at the barn door hanging on one hinge, the grave marker at the western edge of the yard, the milk cow nobody had touched in 2 days, the house that smelled like a man who had been alone too long and was losing the fight against it. She set her canvas sack on the ground. "The advertisement said negotiable," she said. "I'm here to negotiate." Cole Harlan stared at her. He had 11 weeks before the bank took everything. He had 31 cattle and no grain and a breeding program he didn't know he was running. She already knew all of that. She'd seen it in the first 5 minutes. She picked up her sack and walked through his door anyway. If this story already has you hooked, don't go anywhere. Subscribe to our channel and follow Ruth's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The man who met her at the livery was not what she had expected. She had expected someone older, someone with the settled, weathered look of a man who had worked the same ground long enough to become part of it. Someone who had placed that advertisement out of practical need, the way a man orders a new plow or a replacement axle because the old one broke and something has to be done about it. Cole Harlan was none of those things. He was standing beside a buckboard when she came through the livery doors, and the first thing she noticed was that the buckboard was drawn by a mule, not a horse. That told her something. A man who hitches a mule to a buckboard when he's going to meet the woman who answered his advertisement is either too proud to admit the horses are gone or too beaten down to care what impression he makes. She wasn't sure yet which kind Cole Harlan was. She filed that question away for later. The second thing she noticed was that he was young. Not young in the way that means hopeful. Young in the way that means recently broken. He had the jaw of a man holding himself together by stubbornness alone, and the eyes of someone who had been awake too many nights in a row, thinking about numbers that wouldn't add up no matter how many times he ran them. He looked at her rifle first, then at her face. He let the silence run a beat too long the way men sometimes did when a woman arrived and turned out to be something different from what they'd pictured in their heads. Ruth was used to that. She let him look. "You're the one who wrote," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am," she said. Another silence. He reached for her canvas sack without asking, set it in the bed of the buckboard. She kept the rifle. "The arrangement is simple," he said, moving to the driver's side. "You manage the house, help with the dairy work, tend the kitchen garden when the ground thaws. In exchange, room board and a wage." "You said negotiable," she said. He paused with one boot on the wheel, spoke. "I did." "So, we'll negotiate." He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not respect exactly, not yet, but the recognition that this was not going to go the way he'd planned it in his head on the drive into town. "At the end of 90 days, he said, "if both parties are satisfied." He did not say the word wife. She noticed that. He also did not say not wife. She noticed that too. She climbed up onto the buckboard without waiting for him to hand her up, settled the rifle across her knees, and looked out at the road ahead. "Then let's get started," she said. The drive out took 40 minutes. Ruth spent those 40 minutes doing what she always did in new country. She watched. She counted. She let the land tell her what it knew before she asked anyone to explain it. 47 fence posts standing. 11 leaning at angles that meant the next hard wind would take them. 6 gone entirely, the wire dragging in the dirt like something that had given up. The north pasture running along the road was winter bare, which was expected for March, but it was carrying about a third of the cattle it should have been carrying, which was not expected. That told her something about the year Cole Harlan had just come through. She didn't say any of this. She just looked. He drove without talking, which she appreciated. Men who filled silence with words when they were nervous made her tired. Cole Harlan drove the way he'd probably done 1,000 times with the automatic ease of a man who knows every rut in a road by feel. But there was a tension in his shoulders that he was working to keep out of his hands on the reins. He was bracing himself, she realized. He was bracing himself for her reaction to whatever was waiting at the end of this drive. That told her the homestead was worse than the advertisement had suggested. When it came into view, she understood why. The house was sod which she'd expected. Plains construction, practical. The plank addition on the east side she had not expected, or rather she'd expected it to be finished. Someone had started it, laid good lumber, framed the walls to a height of 8 feet, and then simply stopped. The roof on the addition had one corner open to the sky. Not collapsed, not damaged by weather, just never finished. Whoever had started that addition had meant to come back to it and never did. There was a milk cow standing in the yard, with the calm authority of an animal that has decided she owns the place. There was a vegetable garden that had been attempted and abandoned. Dead corn stalks from the previous summer still standing in their rows, gray and brittle as old bone. The barn door was hanging on one hinge, swinging slightly in the March wind, and at the western edge of the property, barely visible from the road, there was a grave marker. A wooden cross, simple, no decoration, newer than the house. Ruth looked at it for exactly 1 second. Then she looked away and did not look back. She stepped down from the buckboard before he came around to help her and walked directly toward the front door. She heard him behind her, heard him pick up her canvas sack and follow. The inside of the house hit her before her eyes adjusted. The smell, wood ash and lard, and something underneath those, something stale, and closed the specific smell of a space where a person has been alone for a long time without enough air moving through it. One room, essentially. Cook stove on the north wall cold. Plank table with 2 chairs. Rope bed in the far corner with a blanket folded across it with the kind of military precision that a man applies to the one thing he can still control when everything else has gotten away from him. Shelves above the stove, holding 4 tins, a clay jug, nothing else. 2 chairs at the table. 2 chairs still even now, even after whatever that cross in the yard represented. She crossed to the stove without speaking and opened the firebox. Cold iron. Gray ash. Nothing banked. Nothing left from a morning fire. She looked at the ash for a moment. "When did you last run this?" she said. "This morning," he said. She looked at the ash again. It had not been this morning. It had not been this morning by at least 20 hours. She closed the firebox door and turned around. "I'll need the wood pile," she said. He showed her around the east side of the house to where the wood was stacked against the unfinished wall of the addition. Partially covered, partially not. The top cords were wet, where the eaves didn't reach them properly. A cord and a half, maybe, of mixed quality. Enough for now. Not enough for another hard freeze if one came. She carried 3 armloads in without asking for help. On the 3rd trip, he moved to help. She noticed when he lifted that he favored his left side. A catch at the shoulder that he suppressed deliberately, the practiced suppression of a man who has been hiding an injury long enough that the hiding has become automatic. She filed that away with everything else. The fire took on the 2nd attempt. She had the stove heating and a pot of water on before he said 10 words. He stood near the door with his hands in his coat pockets, slightly in and slightly out of his own house, the way a man stands in a space that has belonged to his grief longer than it has belonged to him. She understood that feeling. She didn't say so. She opened 2 of the 4 tins on the shelf. Salt pork. Dried beans. She found a heel of cornbread, wrapped in cloth near the window, and added that to the inventory. She set water to heat and began to work. "The cow," she said without turning around. "What about her?" "She hasn't been milked today." A pause. "No." "Yesterday." A longer pause. "I've been managing." She turned then and looked at him directly for the first time since the yard. He was perhaps 32, maybe younger under the weathering. His jaw was set with the particular stubbornness of a man who knows he is failing at something and is not ready to say so out loud. There was flour on his left sleeve from a baking attempt he hadn't mentioned. She didn't mention it either. "I'll do the milking after supper," she said. "Then I need you to tell me everything that needs doing and in what order you think it needs doing." He looked at her like she'd said something in a language he almost recognized. "All right," he said. "Sit down," she said. "Supper won't be long." She served without ceremony. Salt pork beans, the cornbread divided equally. 2 tin cups of water, one placed at his side without asking whether he wanted it. He watched her move around the table, the way a man watches someone rearrange furniture he'd forgotten was supposed to be arranged. Not with suspicion. With something closer to a man realizing he'd been so long in the dark that he'd stopped noticing it until someone lit a lamp. They ate. The wind came up outside, pushing at the door in slow, exploratory pulses. "The south fence," she said. He looked up from his plate. 3 posts down between the creek bend and the cottonwood stand. I saw it on the drive in. Your cattle haven't found it yet. They will probably within the week if the wind shifts. He set his fork down. He didn't argue. She noted that. He didn't argue with true things simply to defend himself. He let them land. "What else did you see?" he said. There was something in the way he said it that told her he had been waiting for this since the moment she stepped off the buckboard. Not dreading it exactly. Something more complicated than dread. The way a man waits for a doctor's verdict when he already knows the news is bad, but needs to hear it spoken before he can start figuring out what to do. She kept her voice flat and practical. "The well cover is warped. Won't seal properly through a hard freeze. The barn roof has a gap on the northwest corner. You can see sky through it from inside, which means you're losing heat every night. You've got animals in there. The kitchen garden has been abandoned too long for this season, but the bed itself is good ground. If you turn it before November, it'll be ready for spring planting." She paused. He was looking at the table. "The hinge on the barn door needs replacing, not repairing. The addition on the east side, what was it going to be?" He was quiet for a moment. "A second room," he said. She waited. "She wanted a proper room," he said. "Away from the stove. For when—" He stopped. Ruth did not fill the silence. She let it sit exactly as long as it needed to sit, and then she moved past it the only way she knew how, practically. "The lumber is still good," she said. "It hasn't weathered past using. The framing is sound. Someone knew what they were doing." "My father taught me," he said. She nodded. "I'll need to see the pasture tomorrow first light." He looked up. "Why?" "Because I need to know what you have before I can tell you what to do with it." He picked up his fork again and then set it down again without eating. "I had a hand through August," he said. He left. "All right," she said. "The place—" He stopped again, started again. "It looked different when I started. When my father—" He exhaled. "It's been a hard few years." "I can see that," she said. "I'm not here to assess blame. I'm here to work." She pushed back from the table. "I'll do the milking now. While I'm out, you pull out whatever records you keep. Finances, cattle, whatever you've got written down. I want to look at them when I get back." He looked at her across the table and said something she hadn't expected. "I didn't think you'd ask practical questions," he said. She paused at the door. "What did you think I'd ask?" He considered it honestly. "I'm not sure," he said. "I didn't think much past the arriving." "Well," she said, taking the lantern from the peg by the door, "I'm here now, so let's think past it." The barn was cold in the way of spaces that have given up on warmth. Not the clean cold of open air, but a still forgotten cold that lived in the corners and didn't move. The roan cow was in the near stall, her bag painfully tight, making a low, miserable sound when she heard boots on the straw. Ruth pulled the stool close and set the pail, and her hands remembered before she had to tell them to. The rhythm came back like a song you haven't sung in a year, but haven't actually forgotten. She let the work settle her. She let herself think while her hands moved. Cole Harlan had not lied in his advertisement. The place was struggling. But struggling was not the same as finished, and she had seen finished, had grown up watching a homestead come apart piece by piece, when there was nothing left to work with, and this was not that. This was something that had stopped, not something that had ended. There was a difference. She believed in that difference the way some people believed in weather signs or scripture. Things that stopped could be started again. Things that ended could not. She finished the milking and held the lantern up and turned slowly the way her father had taught her, not looking for anything in particular, just letting what was wrong announce itself. The loft was partially collapsed on the south end. A section of planking gone. The hay remaining was old and mouse-run. Along the far wall, hanging on square nails, were 3 horse collars in reasonable condition, a leather trace worn through at the loops, and a bridle with the bit still in it. A plain snaffle brown with oxidation, but not broken. She unhooked the bridle and turned it in the lantern light. The stitching was fine. Too fine for this barn. It had come here from somewhere else. From a life that used to be better than this one. She hung it back carefully. On the floor behind the dead buckboard, she found 4 fence posts still in their binding. A crock of axle grease sealed with a tin lid. A coil of wire properly rolled and tied, not thrown. She stood in the lantern light and let herself understand what she was looking at. The wire was coiled by a man who expected to come back for it. The grease crock was sealed by a man who thought it would be used again. This was not a place that had been stripped by desperation. It had been put down in the middle of motion, like a tool set on a workbench at the end of a day, by someone who meant to pick it up again in the morning, and then something happened that morning to prevent it. She scratched the roan once behind the ear before she lifted the pail, and the cow pressed into it with the dumb, trusting weight of an animal that had not yet given up on people. Neither had Ruth. He was at the table when she came back, in a ledger open in front of him and a stub of pencil in his hand. Columns of numbers that she could read from across the room were not adding up to anything encouraging. She hung her coat. She set the milk pail on the shelf. She wiped the outside of it with a rag and set it where the other crocks were, because leaving things in the wrong place overnight had a way of becoming permanent. He looked up from the ledger. Something in his face had shifted while she was out. Some increment of the armor had loosened. Not much, just enough to show that he was tired of holding it in place. "The roan will come back if she gets grain," Ruth said, pulling out the chair across from him. "She's thin, but not ruined." "I know," he said. "Is there grain?" He looked at the ledger. No, she had assumed as much. She pulled the ledger toward her without asking for permission. He didn't stop her. The note was the largest line. She saw it immediately. Due in March. 11 weeks from now. She looked at the other columns. The cattle entries. The winter feed costs. The entry from September that said simply, "Sold 1 bull," and an amount that had bought him roughly 60 days. She looked up. "How many head do you have?" 31, I think," he said. "Maybe 32. I haven't ridden the south pasture in 3 weeks. "Why not?" A pause. "I had a cough. I've been—" He stopped. Started again with the honesty of a man who has run out of the energy required for pretending. "I've been having trouble keeping up." She looked at him the way she'd been taught to look at sick cattle, not with alarm, with assessment. He wasn't fevered. But there was a reduction to him the way a fire looks at 4 in the morning, still burning, but smaller than it should be, running on what's left rather than what it started with. "You need to eat more than you've been eating," she said. He looked slightly startled. "I'm fine." "You're not fine," she said without unkindness. "But that's not the most urgent problem right now." She tapped the note line in the ledger. "This is, tell me about the south pasture." And something happened then that she hadn't expected. He told her. Not in the reluctant, abbreviated way of a man who feels interrogated. He told her the way a person talks when they've been carrying something heavy alone for so long, that the moment someone asks the right question, the whole weight of it comes out in one long exhale. He told her about the creek that ran from higher land to the west, catching snowmelt, and releasing it slow through the dry months when every other water source in the county was failing. He told her about the 80 acres of mixed grass in the south pasture, bluestem and buffalo grass, that in a good year his cattle could graze clean by October. He told her he'd started the year with 41 head and sold 1 bull in September to make the first note payment, and lost 7 to illness in the summer and 2 in a bog crossing in August. 31 head, possibly 32. She did the arithmetic in her head before he finished talking. She looked at the window at the dark outside it, at the small yellow square the lamp made against all that darkness. "Show me everything tomorrow," she said. "Before full light. All of it. I need to see what you have before I can tell you what's worth saving." He was quiet for a moment. The pencil turned in his fingers. Then he said the thing she had not expected him to say. "Why are you doing this?" he said. "You could have gone somewhere else. Answered a different advertisement. Somewhere that wasn't—" He gestured at the ledger at the room at all of it. "This." Ruth looked at him across the lamp. "I answered the advertisement that was honest," she said. "Most of them aren't." She stood and took her cup to the shelf. "Get some sleep. We're going out at first light, and I'll need you moving." She climbed the ladder to the small loft that was apparently where she was meant to sleep, and she lay on the narrow rope bed in the dark and listened to the wind work at the corners of the house. That flat patient plains whined the kind that doesn't give up, and she thought about the coiled wire and the sealed grease crock and the bridle that had come from a better life and was still whole. Things that stop can be started again. She believed that. She had to. It was the only currency she had left. He was up before she was. When she came down the ladder, he was already at the stovecoat on coffee made in black. He did not say good morning in the soft way of a man trying to make an impression. He handed her a cup and moved toward the door, and she thought a man who doesn't move slowly in the morning is a man who hasn't given up on the day yet. She filed that under things worth keeping. They went out while the sky was still the color of a bruise fading at the edges. He walked the property the way a man walks something he knows by feel no hesitation at the turns. North fence first down along the creek bank, then out to the south pasture, where the long slope opened in the early gray light. She did not speak. She watched. She counted the fence posts with their bright new nail heads where he'd done recent repairs, and the old tied wire where he hadn't gotten to it yet. She read the creek's water level and thought about what it meant for the snowpack on the western shelf. She put her hand on the braced wall of the half-collapsed outbuilding at the far end of the pasture and pressed to feel the give. There was some, but not much. Someone had done that work recently enough to matter. She looked at the cattle, 31 of them moving through the pale morning with their breath rising in columns. Calm, but not fat. Fed through the winter, but barely. She watched how they moved, and she let the movement tell her what she needed to know about calving, about herd health, about what kind of attention these animals had received through the critical seasons. At the far corner of the south pasture, she stopped and turned and looked at the full sweep of it. The slope that caught afternoon light. The creek bend where the floodplain widened, and the soil would be deep and dark if you dug down through the crust. The grass in the low areas, taller than it should be, untouched for years. "How long since you ran cattle through the summer properly?" she said. He was quiet long enough that she already knew the answer. 8 years, he said, then quieter, like a correction he was making to himself rather than to her. 8 years, if you count the summer. I lost the herd too small to make the rotation worth the effort. 8 years. She turned back to the land. 8 years of underuse had done something here that was not damage. The grass had grown in the low areas beyond what a grazed pasture would carry. The creek bank where cattle hadn't pushed through had healed into a dense fringe of cottonwood and willow. The soil in the floodplain had 30 years of silt laid down in it from the snowmelt creek, and nobody had asked it to work in nearly a decade. "How many head do you think this land would carry?" she said. He considered it. "Maybe 60, he said. "In a good year." "More than that," she said. He looked at her. The floodplain alone, managed in rotation, would carry 20 additional animals through a dry summer. The creek bank needs 1 season of rest, put a temporary fence across the damaged corridor, and let it heal. And the south pasture has never been cross-fenced, has it? It wasn't a question. She could see from the wire layout that it hadn't. "No," he said. "You've been overgrazing the easy ground and leaving the hard ground untouched. If you move them through in sections, you get better use from the whole pasture and the ground recovers faster. She turned to face him. I need to see your calving records. Something moved across his face then. Quick, there and gone. Not quite relief, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man who has been asked the right question for the first time in longer than he can remember. I keep them, he said. I know you do, she said. Let's go look at them. She was already walking back toward the house. She didn't look back to see if he was following. She knew he was, and walking behind her through his own land, watching her move through it like she was reading a language the land had been writing for 8 years, and waiting for someone to finally translate. Cole Harlan felt something he hadn't felt in longer than he cared to admit. He felt like something that had stopped might possibly carefully, tentatively be about to start again. The calving ledger was bound in brown canvas, the spine repaired twice with waxed thread, and when Cole set it on the table in front of her, Ruth understood immediately that this was not a record kept out of obligation. A man keeps records out of obligation, and the pages look like obligation. Thin entries missing months' numbers without context. This ledger was different. The entries ran back 9 years, and they ran in 2 different hands. The first hand was cramped and careful. Every letter formed with deliberate precision, the handwriting of a man who had taught himself to write as an adult and never forgot the effort it cost him. Birth dates, birth weights, notes on weather conditions during difficult calvings, small observations about individual animals written in the margins in ink so faded it was nearly gone. That hand ran from the first page through the spring of 1889 and then stopped. Not tapered off, stopped. Mid-sentence in an April entry, as if the pen had simply been set down and never picked back up, Cole's own handwriting picked up that same April. Looser. The letters of a man who'd learned to write young and taken it for granted. But the entries continued without a break in the sequence, without a blank page between the 2 hands, without any acknowledgement of the transition at all. The father's last entry and the son's first entry were separated by a single line on the same page. Ruth looked at that for a long moment. She didn't say anything about it. Sit down, she said instead. This is going to take a while. Cole pulled out the chair across from her and sat. He folded his hands on the table and waited, which she appreciated more than she would say. Most men in his position would have been talking, explaining, justifying, filling the silence with words that were really just a way of trying to control what she found before she found it. Cole Harlan sat across from her and let her read. She went through the ledger the way her father had taught her to read range, not rushing toward conclusions, but letting the patterns surface on their own. Birth dates clustered in early spring, which was right. Birth weights where he'd recorded them, and he'd recorded them more consistently than most men she'd known. Notes on which cows had needed pulling, which had rejected their calves and required fostering, which bulls had thrown the strongest firstborns across multiple seasons. The data was thinner in some years. She could tell which years had been the hard ones not by anything he'd written, but by what he hadn't. Thin years produced thin records. A man who is fighting to survive doesn't always have time to write things down carefully. But the thread of it was there intact, running through good years and bad ones alike. 9 years of intention. She turned back to the beginning and started again this time, looking for something specific. The winter of 1891, she said without looking up. Tell me about it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, cold snap came in February. Less than 6 hours, temperature dropped 40 degrees before midnight. We lost 11 head. Which 11? He stopped. I don't know exactly. The ones that couldn't hold. Did you mark which animals survived it? He leaned forward and pointed to a cluster of small marks she had taken for ink smudges. A symbol he'd invented himself, a small double line repeated next to certain entries throughout that winter's pages. She looked at those marks. Then she started turning back through the pages, tracing those marked animals backward through the ledger, following their lineage, the way you follow a creek upstream to find where the water comes from. The pattern took her 6 pages to confirm. When she found it, she sat very still for a moment. Cole, she said. Yes. This cross? She turned the ledger to face him and put her finger on an entry from 1888. This bull, the one you traded for in the fall of 1888. What do you remember about him? Cole looked at the entry. His jaw shifted slightly, the particular movement of a man reaching back into memory for something he hasn't thought about in a long time. Big animal, he said. Roan-colored. I traded 2 yearlings and a harness for him. Man I bought him from said he'd throw good calves in hard conditions. He was right, Ruth said. Look. She turned the ledger back to face her and walked him through what she'd found, entry by entry. The calves that had survived the 1891 cold snap were not random. They were concentrated in a specific set of cows that had all been bred to that roan bull or to his sons. The ones that had died were almost entirely from the older bloodline, the animals predating the 1888 trade. Cole stared at the pages. His expression did something complicated. You've been breeding toward something without knowing you were doing it, she said. The cross your father started in 1888, you've kept it going for 9 years. 14 cows in your current herd carry that bloodline. Both your remaining bulls have it. Cole looked up from the ledger. There was something in his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not hope exactly. Hope was too clean a word for it. It was more like the expression of a man who has been walking in the dark for a long time, and suddenly realizes the dark has been thinning for the last mile without him noticing. My father picked that bull, he said. I always thought it was just luck. It wasn't luck, she said. And then she said, Is there another notebook? The question landed on him like something physical. She watched him process it, watched his expression change. Why? He said. Because the entries in this ledger after 1889 reference decisions without explaining them. Your father was working towards something specific. This ledger shows the results but not the reasoning. If he was the kind of man who kept records this carefully. Cole was already pushing back from the table. He went to the back room, the small space behind the main room that she hadn't seen yet, and she heard him moving things. A scrape of wood on wood, the sound of something being lifted down from a high shelf. He came back with a smaller book. Older. The cover was gone entirely, the pages soft with handling, the corners rounded from years of being opened and opened again. He set it on the table in front of her and didn't say anything. She opened it to the first page. The cramped, careful handwriting filled the page, margin to margin. The same hand from the early ledger entries. She read the first 3 sentences, and then she stopped and read them again. What survives a hard winter is not always what looks the strongest in summer. I have learned this twice now at too great a cost to learn it a 3rd time. I am beginning again with different principles. She set the book down very carefully, the way you set down something fragile. She looked at Cole. How old were you when your father died? She said. 11, he said. She looked back at the book. She turned to the next page and the next, and she read with the particular focused silence of someone who has just realized they are holding something that matters more than they expected. The old man had not been breeding for weight. She had assumed that because weight was what the market rewarded, it was what any sensible cattleman would breed toward. But the language in this notebook was different from anything she'd seen in a ranch record before. The words that appeared again and again were not weight or gain or market value. They were constitution and hardiness and endurance through adversity. And once, in a margin note so small, she had to angle the page toward the lamp to read it in handwriting slightly less careful than the rest, as if it had been added quickly in a moment of conviction rather than deliberation. Outlast the bad years. That was the whole note. 3 words. Outlast the bad years. She sat with that for a moment. The lamp between them threw its small warm light across the page. Cole, she said. Your father lost a herd before you were born. A significant one. Cole was very still. 2/3, he said quietly. In a single winter, before I was born. He never talked about it directly, but I knew. It changed the way he thought about everything. It changed the way he bred cattle, Ruth said. She turned the notebook to face him. He wasn't trying to build the biggest herd or the heaviest calves. He was trying to build a herd that would still be standing after the kind of winter that killed 2/3 of everything he'd built before. She paused. And then he died before he could finish it. And you continued it without knowing you were continuing it, for 9 years. Cole looked at the notebook for a long time without speaking. When he finally looked it up, his jaw was set, but his eyes were doing something different from what she'd seen in them before. There was a roughness there, a rawness. The particular rawness of a man who has just been told that the thing he thought he'd failed at was actually the thing he'd been succeeding at all along. "I thought I was just keeping what he left," Cole said. "I didn't think I was—" He stopped, pressed his mouth together, started again. "I sold 2 of that bloodline last summer, to make the September payment." Ruth looked at him. "Which 2?" she said. He told her. She turned back through the ledger and found them. She sat with that for a moment, calculating something in her head that she didn't say out loud yet. Then she pulled the stub of pencil from her coat pocket and turned to a blank page at the back of the ledger. "I'm going to need an hour," she said. "Don't talk to me." He didn't. He refilled her coffee and set it beside her hand without interrupting, and she worked. What she built on this page over the next hour was not what he would have expected. She wasn't writing a list of which animals to sell and which to keep. She was drawing a map. A breeding map. 14 cows laid out in columns with their calving history, noted beneath each one. The 2 remaining bulls treated separately, with their lineage traced through both the old notebook and the newer ledger, cross-referenced with the winter survival marks, and the calving weights and the notes on which mothers had been the easiest, and which had given trouble. She crossed things out. She turned back to the older pages 3 times. She made small notations in the margin that were partially his father's abbreviation system, adopted unconsciously, because she'd been looking at the old notebook long enough that it had become the language she thought in when she thought about these cattle. Cole watched her work. He did not interrupt. He sat across the table and watched a woman he had known for less than 24 hours rebuild something his father had started, and he had continued without knowing. And he felt something he could not name precisely, but that had something to do with not being alone in this anymore. When she set the pencil down, it was because she had reached a conclusion. "The older bull," she said. "What about him? He's the one you keep. Regardless of anything else, regardless of what the numbers say about feed cost or his age, you keep him." She turned the ledger to face him and pointed to an entry from 4 years back. "Read this." He leaned forward and read the entry. A calving note. March 4 years ago. Calf born in a late storm. No shelter reached in time. Temperature, she noted, had been brutal, the kind of cold that came on fast with no warning. The entry recorded the birth time, and then 6 hours later, calf standing, taking milk, strong. Cole sat back. "That calf was from the older bull," he said. "Out of a cow from the 1888 cross," Ruth said. "The combination your father was working toward. Born in conditions that should have killed it standing and nursing 6 hours later." She looked at him directly. "Your father spent 12 years trying to breed an animal that could outlast the bad years. That calf is the proof he got there, and the bull that threw it is still in your pasture." The room was very quiet. The wind outside had settled into the low, persistent sound of a plains night at rest, just a slow push against the walls, nothing violent, nothing urgent. The lamp between them burned low and steady. Cole looked at the page. He looked at the lamp. He looked at his hands flat on the table. "I didn't know any of this," he said. "I know you didn't," Ruth said. "But you kept the records. You kept the animals. You kept the notebook even after the cover fell off." She paused. "You kept everything worth keeping. You just didn't know yet what you had." Cole looked up at her, and something passed between them across the table, across the lamp, across the 2 notebooks, and the 9 years of entries in 2 different hands, something that was not quite a declaration and not quite a question, but occupied the same territory as both. Then he looked away. He looked at the fire in the stove, the way a man looks at something when he is trying to appear composed and nearly succeeding. "What do we do?" he said. "With all of this. The note is 11 weeks out, and I've got 31 head and no grain and a bull nobody's asked me about in 3 years." "You let me write the plan," Ruth said. She turned to a fresh page. "And then you tell me honestly whether you can do what it asks." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What if I can't?" "Then we figure out what you can do instead," she said. "But I've learned not to tell a man what he can't do until he's had the chance to try." Something at the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, the shape of one, the ghost of one, the way a fire looks in a cold room before it fully catches just the suggestion of warmth. Not warmth itself yet, but the promise that warmth is possible. "All right," he said. "All right," she said, and bent over the page and started to write. Outside, the wind was still working at the corners of the house. The roan cow had gone quiet in the barn. The lamp burned lower, and Cole got up without being asked, and trimmed the wick, and sat back down, and watched Ruth Calloway write the future of his ranch onto the back pages of his father's 9-year record, in a hand that was neither his father's nor his own, but somehow belonged here anyway, in this room, at this table, under this particular lamp, on this particular March night, when everything that had stopped was very slowly, very carefully beginning to move again. She wrote for another half hour. He did not interrupt. When she finally set the pencil down, she did not look up immediately. She looked at what she'd written. She read it back to herself the way she always read things back, not looking for errors exactly, but listening for whether it told the truth. It told the truth. She pushed it across the table to him. "Read it," she said. "All of it. I'll wait." He read slowly. She watched his eyes move down the page. Stop, go back, move forward again. She watched his jaw tighten once at something in the second column, the longer changes, the ones that would take 2 or 3 years to show, and then relax again. When he finished, he set the page down and looked at her. "This works," he said. "Not a question, not quite. The way a man says something when he wants it to be true and is trying to determine from the sound of his own voice whether he believes it. It works if the weather cooperates, and if the older bull throws what the records say he should throw, and if you can hold the note through 1 more season," Ruth said. "That's 3 conditions, and I can only control one of them." "Which one?" "The bull," she said. "I know which cows to put him with and when. The rest is up to the land and the bank." Cole looked at the page again. He turned it over and looked at the blank back of it, as if there might be something written there too. There wasn't. He turned it back. "Why are you telling me the honest version?" he said. "Most people would have just said it works and let me believe it." Ruth looked at him across the table. The lamp was burning very low now. The light it threw was narrow and warm, and in that light his face looked younger than it had on the buckboard, or maybe just less defended. "Because if it doesn't work," she said, "I want you to know I told you the true odds. And if it does work, I want you to know that was real too." She stood up and took her cup to the shelf. "I've had enough of arrangements built on what people wanted to hear. I'd rather build something on what's actually true." She climbed the ladder to the loft. Below her, she heard Cole sit at the table for a long time without moving. She heard him pick up the old notebook, the one without a cover, the one with his father's handwriting and the margin note she hadn't been able to stop thinking about since she'd read it. She heard him read, and in the dark of the loft, listening to the wind settle and the stove tick and the sound of a man reading his father's words, for perhaps the first time, with the understanding to know what he was reading, Ruth Calloway stared at the ceiling and thought outlast the bad years. 3 words. She thought she could do that. She thought she had been doing exactly that for longer than she'd known it had a name. The banker's name was Gerald Holt, and Ruth disliked him before he opened his mouth. She could tell the kind of man he was from the way he arranged himself behind the desk when they walked in, not sitting back, not leaning forward, but positioned with the particular deliberate stillness of a man who has learned that stillness reads as power in a room where he controls everything worth controlling. He had soft hands and a hard smile, and he looked at Ruth the way men like him always looked at women who walked into rooms they weren't expected to occupy. He looked at Cole. "I wasn't aware you'd be bringing company, Mr. Harlan. Miss Calloway manages the ranch operations. Cole said. He said it the way he'd been saying it for 6 weeks now, without hesitation, without apology, without the slight downward inflection that would have made it a qualification. Ruth had noticed when he'd stopped qualifying it. It had been around the 3rd week, the week he'd ridden the south fence line with her in the snow, and watched her read the pasture the way his father used to read it, and hadn't said anything for a long time afterward. Holt looked at her again. "Operations," he said. "That's correct," Ruth said. She set the ledger on his desk. Not the calving ledger, the financial one. She had spent the previous evening recopying Cole's numbers into a format she thought a banker would recognize and respect, clear columns running totals projections laid out across 3 rows, conservative, moderate, and what she actually believed would happen if the spring calving went the way the older bull's record suggested it would. Holt looked at the ledger without picking it up. "The note is due in 5 weeks, Mr. Harlan." "We're aware of when the note is due," Ruth said. "We're here to discuss the terms of an extension." Holt's eyes moved to her. "The bank doesn't typically—" "The bank extended credit to this ranch twice in the past 4 years," Ruth said. "Both times on the strength of projected cattle values that were lower than what I'm projecting now, and both times without the breeding program data we're bringing you today." She opened the ledger to the page she'd marked. "I'd like you to look at column 3. Holt looked at Cole. Cole looked at Holt with the steady, tired patience of a man who has decided to let someone else steer for once and is discovering that the experience is less terrifying than he expected. Holt looked at the ledger. Ruth watched his eyes move down the column. She had written the projection conservatively enough to be defensible and ambitiously enough to be worth his attention. The spring calving numbers were based on 9 years of records and the specific breeding cross she'd documented from the old notebook. She had not inflated them. She had not needed to. "This breeding program," Holt said. "You're saying you can project calf survival rates based on 9 years of documented calving records and a specific bloodline cross that has demonstrated measurably superior survival rates in adverse conditions," Ruth said. "The data is in the supporting ledger if you'd like to see it." Holt set the financial ledger down and looked at her with the expression of a man recalculating something he thought he had already calculated. "How long have you been at the Harlan Ranch, Miss Calloway?" 6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks, he repeated. "The records are 9 years old," she said. "I didn't create the data, I read it." A silence settled over the office. Holt picked up the ledger again and turned to the next page. Ruth let him read. Cole sat beside her with his hat in his hands and his jaw set and said nothing, which was exactly what she'd asked him to do on the drive into town. "Let me talk," she'd said. "You talk when he asks you a direct question and not before." He'd looked at her for a moment and then nodded, and she'd understood that the nod cost him something, that it was not the natural posture of a man who had run his own land for 12 years, and she'd appreciated that he gave it anyway. "The extension would be 60 days, Holt said finally. 90, Ruth said. 60 is the standard? Spring calving runs through the end of April, Ruth said. A 60-day extension from today puts the payment due before the calves are weaned and marketable. You'd be calling the note on an asset that increases in value by roughly 30% between April and June. 90 days serves the bank's interests as well as ours. Holt looked at her for a long moment. The kind of look that is really a series of rapid assessments wearing the mask of a single expression. 90 days, he said, at the current rate. Agreed, Ruth said. She closed the ledger before he could change his mind. On the drive back to the ranch, Cole was quiet for the first 3 miles. The mule moved at its steady, unimpressible pace, and the afternoon light lay flat and cold across the road, and neither of them spoke. Then Cole said, "You told him the bank's interests." "I did?" Ruth said. "You meant it." "A man who thinks you're serving his interests is a man who gives you what you need," she said. "That's not manipulation. That's just understanding who you're talking to." Cole was quiet for another mile. Then, "Where did you learn to talk like that?" She looked at the road ahead. "My father ran a trading post for 11 years, she said. "I watched him negotiate every supply order, every credit line, every price dispute that came through the door. He said the secret to any negotiation was to find the thing the other person needed more than they needed to say no. What did Holt need? To look competent, Ruth said. A banker who extends credit to a struggling ranch and loses the money looks foolish. A banker who extends credit based on documented projections and recovers the note with interest looks like a man who knows how to read an opportunity. She glanced at him. I gave him the second version. Cole made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but close. It was the first time she'd heard anything like a laugh from him, and it landed differently than she expected. Not loud, not easy. Just a brief release of something he'd been holding, the way a door opens slightly in a sealed room, and the air pressure shifts. She looked back at the road. She did not remark on it. They had 5 weeks before the note's new deadline fell. Ruth spent those weeks the way she'd spent every week since she arrived, moving from one priority to the next, with the flat efficiency of a woman who had learned early that sentiment was something you earned after the work was done, not before. The south fence came first. Cole had the wire and the posts, and she had the knowledge of exactly where the breaks were from her first morning survey. They worked it together, him setting posts while she ran the wire, and she learned his pace quickly and adjusted to it without making a production of the adjustment. He was stronger than he looked despite the shoulder, and he worked with a focused quiet that she had come to understand was not unfriendliness, but concentration. Cole Harlan concentrated the way some men prayed, fully without distraction, with the sense that the thing he was doing was the only thing that existed while he was doing it. By the third day, she had learned to read when he needed to stop and give the shoulder rest without him saying so. She would simply move to the next post herself, do the work that didn't require 2 people, give him 10 minutes without making the 10 minutes a thing that needed to be discussed. He noticed. She could tell he noticed by the way he didn't say anything about it. Some acknowledgments are louder in silence than in words. The barn door hinge was next. She found a replacement in the back of the barn, and Cole hung the new hinge while she held the door level. And they were close enough that she could hear him breathing through the effort of the overhead work, the slight catch in his breath when the shoulder pulled. She did not ask if he was all right. She had noticed that asking made it worse. Instead, she adjusted the angle she was holding the door at to take some of the reach out of the work, and he said nothing, and neither did she, and the door hung straight and true by noon. The cow was improving. Ruth had been supplementing the roan's feed with grain she'd located in a sealed crate behind the collapsed loft section, good grain dry, still viable. The cow's ribs were less prominent now, and her milk production had come up enough that Ruth was making a small surplus. She began trading the surplus milk with 2 families in town eggs from one cured pork from the other. She didn't tell Cole she was doing this until the 3rd week, when she set a basket of eggs on the table at breakfast, without explanation. He looked at the eggs. He looked at her. The Hendersons, she said, 2 miles east. Their daughter has a good laying flock, and they can use the milk. He looked at the eggs for another moment. You bartered the milk. Surplus milk, she said. The cow's producing more than we need. He sat down and picked up his fork. My father used to trade with the Hendersons, he said. I know, she said. Mrs. Henderson told me. He looked up. She also told me that your father once rode 10 miles in a January ice storm to help Henderson pull a calf, Ruth said, and that Henderson has been meaning to return the favor for 14 years. She set her own plate down. He's coming Saturday to help rebrace the addition. Cole put his fork down. You organized that. It needed doing, she said. And Henderson volunteered. I didn't ask him to. Cole looked at her across the table, and she could see him working through how he felt about this, the particular complicated arithmetic of a proud man confronted with help he needed and didn't ask for and isn't sure he deserves. I would have gotten to it, he said. I know you would have, she said. Now you'll get to it sooner. He picked up his fork, set it down again. Ruth. What? Thank you, he said. Like the words cost him something, like he was paying for them with something real. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at her plate. Eat your eggs, she said. We've got fence to finish before dark." Henderson came on Saturday with his oldest son, and the three of them worked the addition from morning through late afternoon. Ruth kept coffee coming and worked alongside them without being asked to handing tools, holding boards, doing the useful invisible work that makes visible work go faster. Cole and Henderson talked while they worked the way men who have known each other a long time talk in half sentences and references, and the particular shorthand of shared history that doesn't need explanation. She stayed out of that. She listened because listening was how she learned things, but she didn't insert herself. There was a shape to Cole and Henderson's friendship that she respected the way she respected a fence line. It marked something real, and she didn't need to cross it to understand where it was. Late in the afternoon, while Cole and the Henderson boy were finishing the roof section, Henderson came to stand beside her where she was cleaning the tools. "He's different," Henderson said low enough that it stayed between them. Ruth kept cleaning. "How do you mean?" "Since you came." Henderson looked at the roof where Cole was working. He used to come into town with a look on him like a man carrying something too heavy for one person, but too proud to put it down. Last time I saw him was different. Ruth set down the tool she was cleaning and picked up the next one. "He's a good rancher," she said. "He's a good man," Henderson said. Was afraid for a while he'd forgotten that. She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. And Henderson, to his credit, didn't push it. He picked up a tool and started cleaning it alongside her, and they worked in companionable silence until Cole called down from the roof that the last beam was set. The addition had a roof, both sides of it. For the first time since whoever had started it had put down their hammer and not come back, Cole stood in the doorway of it that evening after Henderson and his son had gone. Ruth came to stand beside him. The space was roughly 12 by 14 feet, no floor yet, no window, just 4 walls and a roof, and the smell of new lumber in the cold air. But it was enclosed, tight. A room-shaped thing that had only been a framework for however long it had been waiting. "She would have liked it," he said. Ruth didn't ask who. She knew who. "I think she would have liked that you finished it," she said. Cole stood with that for a moment. His jaw did the thing it did when he was holding something in that slight forward set, the physical equivalent of a door pulled shut. Then he said, "The calving starts in 3 weeks." "I know," she said. "You still think the older bull—" "I know the older bull," she said. "I've been watching him for 6 weeks. He's exactly what your father's notebook said he was." She paused. "The question is, the weather." Cole looked at the darkening sky through the open doorway. "It's been a mild February." "Mild Februaries make for hard marches sometimes," she said. "Sometimes," he agreed. They stood in the incomplete room in the early dark, the smell of new wood around them, and Ruth thought about what Henderson had said. He used to carry something too heavy for one person. She thought about the grave marker at the western edge of the property that she had never asked about, and Cole had never offered. She thought about the 2 chairs at the table that had stayed 2 chairs even after one of them went unused. She thought about the military fold of the blanket on the rope bed on the day she arrived, the one thing in the house that had been tended to. She had learned in 6 weeks to understand the shape of what Cole Harlan had lost without needing to know all the details. The details were his. The shape of it was visible in everything else, in the way he moved through the house, like he was still half a guest in it, in the way he'd kept the calving records going without a break, even through the worst of it, in the way he'd placed that advertisement in the Amarillo Weekly Courier and used the word negotiable, as if he were trying to be honest about the fact that he didn't entirely know what he was asking for. She had understood that word from the beginning. Negotiable meant, "I don't know what I need, but I know I can't do this alone, and I am asking someone to help me figure out the rest." She had answered it because she understood it, because she had been doing the same thing for longer than she wanted to admit. She turned away from the doorway. "I'm going to check the cattle," she said. "Then I want to look at the calving pairs one more time before we bring them in." "I'll come with you," he said. She had expected him to say he'd start supper. He'd been taking on more of the kitchen work lately, gradually, and without announcement, the way he did most things, not making a production of a change, just making it. She had noticed. She hadn't remarked on it. "All right," she said, and they walked out into the cold together. 3 weeks later, the calving started. And the weather, which had been mild and reasonable and almost cooperative, chose that exact moment to remember what February in the Texas Panhandle was actually capable of. The temperature dropped 22 degrees in 4 hours. Ruth was in the barn when she felt the shift not in the thermometer, but in the cattle. The way the animals stiffened and drew together, the way the older cows moved toward the walls. Animals knew. They always knew before people did. She went to the door and looked at the sky. What she saw made her turn immediately. "Cole," she said sharply. He was at the far stall. He looked up. He saw her face and he crossed the barn in 8 steps. "How many are showing?" she said. He had done the morning check. 3, maybe 4. "Get them inside," she said. "All of them showing, right now. The barn won't hold. The barn will hold what it has to hold," she said. "Go." He went. She went to the first cow already in the stall, a deep-chested animal from the 1888 cross, older now, but still strong sides, heaving with the beginning of labor. Ruth had delivered calves in worse conditions than this. She had delivered calves in conditions she didn't like to think about. Her hands knew what to do before her mind finished the instruction. The first calf came in 40 minutes, a big one. The cow did the work mostly herself, which was what Ruth had expected from that bloodline. She cleared the calf's mouth and stepped back and watched the cow turn to it and begin the cleaning, and the calf's legs moved, scrambled, went still, moved again. Cole had gotten the other 3 inside. He came back into the first stall, breathing hard from the cold and the work, and stopped when he saw the calf on the ground already moving. "First one," Ruth said without looking up. He stood in the stall doorway, said nothing for a moment. Then, "How is she?" "Good," Ruth said. "This bloodline knows how to do this." The temperature kept dropping through the night. They worked the barn in shifts without discussing shifts. Ruth taking the first hours, Cole the middle hours. Ruth again toward dawn. When she came in for her middle-of-the-night break, she found Cole had made coffee and left it hot on the stove, and she drank it standing up and went back out. By morning, they had 7 calves. All 7 were standing. All 7 were nursing. Cole counted them in the pale early light, moving from stall to stall, with the deliberate care of a man who is afraid that if he counts too quickly, he might miss something or make it less real. Ruth leaned against the stall door and watched him count. When he got to 7, he stopped. He stood with his back to her for a moment. She saw his shoulders move. 1 breath in, 1 breath out. Then he turned around, and the look on his face was something she had not seen there before. Not hope, not relief. Something past those. Something that looked like a man recognizing his own life for the first time in a long time. 7, he said. 7, she said. He looked at her across the barn, across the smell of hay, and new life, and cold air, and the particular warmth that 7 calves and their mothers generate when they are all breathing and standing and doing what they are supposed to do. "You knew," he said. "I believed," she said. "That's not the same thing." He nodded slowly. He looked at the calves again. Then he looked back at her. "The note is in 4 weeks, he said. "I know," she said. "We're going to make it," he said. Not a question this time. Not the tentative hoping version of that sentence. The other version. The version that comes from a man standing in a barn full of living proof, looking at the woman who read 9 years of his family's records and understood what they were saying before he did. Ruth looked at him. She let the statement stand. "We should get breakfast," she said. "We've got 3 more cows showing and a long day ahead." But she was already almost smiling when she turned toward the barn door, and she kept her face pointed away from him until it passed. Some things you keep to yourself. Not because they don't matter, because they matter too much to put into the cold air before they're ready. They made the note payment with 6 days to spare. Ruth set the money on Holt's desk, herself. Counted it out in front of him. Bill by bill, the way her father had taught her to conduct any transaction where the other party might later claim a discrepancy. Holt watched her count without speaking. When she finished, she pushed the stack toward him, and he looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man who had privately expected to be acquiring a piece of land this month and was recalibrating. "The account is current," he said. "It is," Ruth said. "The spring calves." He paused. The survival rate was higher than projected. "It was consistent with the breeding records," Ruth said, "which is what I told you it would be in January." Holt looked at her. Then he looked at Cole, who was standing slightly behind her left shoulder, with his hat in his hands and the patient expression of a man who has learned something in the past 3 months about when to let someone else carry the conversation. "Mr. Harlan," Holt said, "you've been with this bank for 9 years. 12, Cole said. "My father before me." Holt made a small sound that was not quite agreement and not quite apology. He signed the receipt and slid it across the desk. Ruth picked it up, folded it once, and put it in her coat pocket. They were in the buckboard and back on the road before either of them said anything. The mule moved at its patient, unimpressible pace. The April morning was warm enough that the frost had gone by mid-morning, and the road was soft with it, and Ruth was thinking about the south pasture cross-fencing that needed to start this week if they were going to rotate the summer cattle properly. "You counted it slow on purpose," Cole said. "I counted it at the speed that prevents disputes," Ruth said. "You wanted him to feel every bill." She looked at the road. "A man who underestimates you once will do it again if you let him walk away comfortable," she said. "I'd rather he remembered this." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is that what your father taught you?" "My father taught me the counting," she said. "The rest I figured out myself." He didn't push further. He had learned in 3 months where her edges were not by testing them, but by paying the same kind of quiet attention to her that she paid to everything else. She had noticed him doing it. It was difficult to notice without noticing what it meant about the kind of man he was. They were a mile from the ranch when he said it. "I want to talk to you about something." Ruth looked at him. His eyes were on the road, and his jaw had that set to it that she now knew meant he was about to say something that cost him. "All right," she said. He pulled the mule to a stop at the side of the road. Not in front of anything, not near the ranch gate. Just stopped on the open road because he apparently needed to say this without the ranch in sight, without the context of the work around them, without the practical landscape of fence posts and cattle providing an exit if the conversation went wrong. She turned on the seat to face him. He was holding the reins loosely in his hands and looking at the space between the mule's ears. Then he looked at her. "The 90 days ended 3 weeks ago," he said. "I'm aware of that," she said. "You haven't said anything about it." "Neither have you," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I didn't know how to start." She waited. She had learned that waiting was often the most useful thing she could do for Cole Harlan, not filling his silences, not completing his sentences, just leaving him space to arrive at the thing he was working toward. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Not as the woman who manages ranch operations. Not on a 90-day arrangement." He stopped, started again. "I'm asking you to stay as my wife, if you're willing, if that's something you'd consider." The mule shifted its weight. The road was empty in both directions. A hawk circled somewhere above them, and its shadow passed briefly across the seat of the buckboard and was gone. Ruth looked at Cole Harlan and thought about the morning she'd arrived. The canvas sack over one shoulder and the rifle over the other, and the driver who hadn't waited for her boots to hit the dirt before he left. The fence post she'd counted on the drive-in, the grave marker she hadn't asked about, the cold stove and the 2 chairs and the military fold of the blanket on the rope bed, the ledger in 2 different hands with no blank page between them. She thought about 7 calves standing in the cold barn at dawn, while Cole counted them with his back to her, and his shoulders moved with the one breath he allowed himself before he turned around. She thought about the word negotiable in a newspaper advertisement that she had read 3 times by lamplight in a boarding house where she owed 2 weeks of rent. "I need to ask you something first," she said. He nodded. His jaw was still set, but his eyes were open in the way they got when he was not defending anything. "The grave," she said. "At the west edge of the property. You've never told me." Something moved through his face, quick and deep. She had wondered if this question would be the wrong one. She had waited 3 months to ask it because she wasn't sure, and she was still not entirely sure, but she needed to know before she answered him. He looked at the road ahead for a moment, then back at her. Her name was Clara, he said. We were married 4 years. She died in the winter of 1890 in February. He stopped. The baby, too. There were complications. I wasn't... He stopped again, and this time the stopping was the kind that meant the words hadn't found their shape yet, that they were still too close to the bone to come out clean. Ruth waited. I wasn't in time, he said. I'd ridden out to check the cattle. The storm came in fast. By the time I got back, he pressed his mouth together. The midwife was there. She'd done what she could. The road was very quiet. Somewhere down the creek line, a meadowlark called once and was quiet again. I kept the 2 chairs, he said. I don't know why. It seemed wrong to move them. It wasn't wrong, Ruth said. He looked at her. I kept working, he said. I kept the records. I kept the calving ledger going. I didn't know what else to do with the... He gestured a small, incomplete gesture that was meant to cover the 3 years of solitude and the grave marker and the addition that had stopped at 8 feet and the advertisement in the Amarillo Weekly Courier. With all of it. You kept everything worth keeping, Ruth said. She had said it to him once before in the kitchen about the ranch. She meant it the same way now. He looked at her for a long moment. I'm not the same man I was when Clara was alive, he said. I don't know how to account for that. I'm not asking you to be the same man, Ruth said. I'm not the same woman I was 4 years ago either. People aren't the same. That's not a flaw. That's just time. He turned that over. Will you tell me, he said, what changed for you? She had not expected him to ask that. She looked at the road for a moment. The fair exchange of it settled something in her, the fact that he asked the fact that he wanted to know who she was before she was this. Before she was the woman who read his father's notebook and argued with his banker and delivered his calves in a temperature drop that had come in without warning. I had a homestead, she said. In Kansas. My father's. He died in the spring of '85 and left it to me, which surprised everyone except him. She paused. I ran it for a year. We had a drought the second summer, and the note came due, and the bank... She stopped. Chose her words. The bank had a buyer ready before the ink was dry on the default notice. I've always thought they had a buyer ready before the drought. Cole was very still. I lost it in September of '86, she said. I had $11 in a boarding house debt by January, and a rifle that was my father's, and a sewing kit I'd had since I was 12. She looked at him. And then I read an advertisement in the Amarillo Weekly Courier. And the word negotiable was the most honest word I'd seen in months. He exhaled slowly. I used that word because I didn't know how to describe what I was asking for, he said. I know, she said. That's why it was honest. They sat on the buckboard in the middle of the road, and the April morning moved around them, warming toward noon, and Ruth thought about what it meant that they had each arrived at this road from the direction of loss. Not the same loss, not even similar losses exactly. But both of them had been stripped of something they'd built, and both of them had kept going anyway. Not because they were particularly brave or particularly strong, but because stopping had never presented itself as an actual option. I'll stay, she said. Cole looked at her. Not because the calving went well, and not because the note is paid, and not because I don't have anywhere better to be, she said. Because this land is worth staying for, and because you are worth working alongside, and because your father started something in that notebook that I want to see finished. She paused. Those are my reasons. They're practical ones. Cole looked at her for a long moment. They're good reasons, he said. I think so, she said. Ruth. What? I have a reason too, he said. It's not practical. She looked at him. He looked back. He didn't dress it up. He didn't reach for words that would make it sound like something other than what it was. He just looked at her with the open, undefended expression that she had seen on his face exactly 3 times before, at the table when she'd told him about his father's breeding program in the barn, when he'd counted 7 calves, and he let her see it. She let herself see it. "All right," she said after a moment. He nodded once. He picked up the reins. They rode the last mile home in a silence that was different from all the other silences they had shared, which had been the silences of 2 people working carefully around each other. This one was something else. This one had room in it. The first thing they did when they got back to the ranch was not what might have been expected. There was no ceremony, no extended conversation, no prolonged acknowledgement of the changed thing between them. Ruth went to check the cattle, and Cole started on the south pasture cross-fencing, and they worked through the afternoon the way they always worked separately in parallel with the comfortable efficiency of 2 people who understand each other's pace. But at supper, Cole set the table, and he put the 2 chairs across from each other as always, and then he stood back and looked at the table for a moment, and he moved one of the chairs to the side, and brought in the chair from the back room, the one that had been there unused since before Ruth arrived, and put it at the head of the table. 3 chairs now, a different arrangement, not erasing anything, just making room. Ruth came in from washing up and saw the chairs. She looked at them. She looked at him. He was at the stove. He didn't explain it. She didn't ask him to. She sat down. He brought supper. They ate. The cross-fencing took 2 weeks. Ruth designed the rotation 4 sections each, carrying roughly 20 animals moved through in sequence, so no section was grazed below recovery before the cattle moved on. Cole built it mostly with her working alongside him, the way they'd worked the south fence in the snow, finding each other's rhythm without discussing it. Henderson's boy came out twice to help with the corner posts. By the time the summer cattle were moved into the first rotation section, the ranch looked different from the road. Not dramatically. Not in the way that makes a person stop and stare. In the way that makes a person look twice because something has shifted that they can't immediately name. The barn door hung straight and true. The addition had its roof. The fence line was clean, the wire properly mended and not merely tied. The kitchen garden had been turned and planted, and something green was beginning to show in the rows. The cattle moved with more purpose. They had direction now, boundaries that made sense, water access that was managed, and not merely wherever they pushed through. The older bull moved through the pasture with the authority of an animal that knows his purpose and has been given room to fulfill it. One afternoon in late May, Ruth was running wire on the east section of the new cross fence when she heard Cole on the road behind the property. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of the buckboard and a second voice she didn't recognize. She kept working. He came to find her 20 minutes later, alone. She didn't look up from the wire. "Who was that?" she said. "Man named Prescott," Cole said. "From Lubbock." "What did he want?" "He wants to buy the ranch," Cole said. Ruth stopped working. She straightened up. She turned around. Cole was standing at the fence line with his hat in one hand and an expression she had not seen on him before, not troubled, not angry, something more complicated, something that was weighing itself. "He offered a fair price," she said. "More than fair," Cole said. "Considerably more than fair." She looked at him. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd think about it." Ruth held the wire tool loosely at her side. She did not say anything. She waited for him to arrive at the rest. "He said something," Cole said. "He said the ranch has been improved significantly in the last few months. Said he'd been watching it from the road when he passes through, and whatever I'd done to the cattle operation had made the whole property worth considerably more than what he'd valued it at in the fall." "That's accurate," Ruth said. "He said he'd pay for that improvement," Cole said, "on top of the base value." Ruth looked at him steadily. "What are you asking me, Cole?" He put his hat back on. He looked at the cross fence at the rotation section where the cattle were moving in their new ordered pattern at the barn, with its straight door at the addition with its finished roof. "I'm asking if you want this," he said. "This specific place, this land. I'm asking because I know you lost land before, And I know what that costs, and I'm asking whether staying here is something you want, or something you've decided is the practical choice, and whether those are the same thing for you." She looked at him for a long time. "They're the same thing," she said. "You're sure?" "Cole." She set the wire tool on the fence post. "I designed that rotation fence. I traced that bloodline through 9 years of records. I argued a 90-day extension out of a man who wanted to say no." She looked at the land around her, at all of it. "I don't do that kind of work for things I don't intend to keep." He stood with that. "Tell Prescott no," she said. She picked up the wire tool. "And next time he comes to the road, he's going to see the summer calves running that south rotation, and I want him to understand exactly what he's not buying." Something crossed Cole's face then. That almost smile she had been cataloging since early March. It was more than an almost smile this time. It was brief and real, and it changed his face entirely for the 3 seconds it lasted. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She turned back to the fence. "Don't call me ma'am," she said. "I've told you that." "You've told me that," he agreed, and she could hear it in his voice. That warmth, still restrained, but no longer hidden the way a fire is contained in a stove, but not pretending it isn't a fire. She kept working. He picked up the other end of the wire and helped her run it. They married in June. Quietly. The Hendersons came, and a woman named Dorothy from town, who had been trading eggs with Ruth for 3 months, and had become something close to a friend. In the practical, unsentimental way, Ruth formed friendships, through consistent reliability and the absence of pretense. The ceremony was short. Ruth had no patience for ceremonies longer than the thing they were marking required, and this one required honesty and intention, and the specific gravity of 2 people who had both lost things and were choosing with full knowledge of what loss felt like to build something anyway. Afterward, Dorothy said something that stayed with Ruth. She said, "You don't look like a woman who just got married." Ruth looked at her. "What do I look like?" Dorothy considered it. "A woman who just signed a contract she's actually going to honor," she said. Ruth thought about that. "That's what marriage is," she said. Dorothy laughed. Cole, who had been standing close enough to hear, said nothing. But Ruth felt him slightly closer. The warmth of him steady and real, not claiming anything, just present. That evening, after the Hendersons left and Dorothy left, and the ranch was quiet with the particular quality of quiet that follows a day that has contained something significant. Cole and Ruth sat on the step of the addition. The finished addition, the room with its roof and its new plank floor, and the window he'd put in the south wall in May, and looked at the property in the late light. The cattle were moving through the second rotation section. The barn door was straight. The kitchen garden had bean plants showing. The grave marker at the western edge caught the last of the light the way it always did at this hour, the wood pale against the grass. "I think she would have liked you," Cole said. Ruth looked at the marker. She had thought about Clara Harlan a number of times over the past months. Not with the complicated feelings that a smaller person might have had, but with something closer to respect. A woman who had wanted a proper room. A woman whose husband had kept her chairs at the table and kept her records and kept working through 3 years of solitude because stopping wasn't in him, and neither Ruth suspected had it been in Clara. "I think she would have been glad someone finished the room," Ruth said. Cole nodded. He looked at the land. "My father's notebook," he said. "The program he started. How long before we see the full results?" 3 more calving seasons, Ruth said. "Maybe 4. You'll know it when you see it. The whole herd will start to look like those 7 calves from March. And if we have a bad winter, then the herd will outlast it," she said. "That's the point." He was quiet. "Then outlast the bad years." "Outlast the bad years," she said. The light was going now, the last of it pulling back from the western edge of the property, from the grave marker, from the fence line, from all of it. The roan cow had gone in for the night. The first stars were showing sharp and specific, the way plain stars got when the air was clear. Ruth sat on the step of the room that had a roof now, and looked at all of it at this place that had been stopped and was now moving at this man beside her who had kept everything worth keeping without knowing what he had, and she thought this is what the word negotiable meant. Not flexible terms, not vague arrangements. It had meant, come and help me understand what this is supposed to be. She had come. She had helped. She had understood. And she had stayed. The third calving season proved everything. Not in the dramatic way that stories sometimes require proof, not in a single morning or a single animal or a single number that made everything suddenly clear. It proved it the way the land proves things slowly accumulating across weeks and months until the evidence is so complete that even a man who has been afraid to believe it has to put his doubt down and acknowledge what he is looking at. By the end of April 1890, the Harlan Ranch had 61 calves on the ground, 58 standing, 58 nursing. The 3 losses had come from the oldest cows animals predating the 1888 cross, and Ruth had already noted in the calving ledger which bloodlines they represented, and what that meant for the fall breeding decisions. She wrote in the third hand, now not the cramped careful print of Cole's father, not Cole's looser script, but her own even deliberate writing that had gradually taken over the current pages, the way a creek gradually takes a new channel, not by force, but by being the path that made the most sense. Cole found her in the barn, the morning after the last calf arrived, standing at the open ledger, with the pencil still in her hand, reading back through what she'd written. 58, he said from the stall door. 58, she said without looking up. You said 3 seasons, he said. Maybe 4. I said you'd know it when you saw it, she said. Do you know it? He was quiet for a moment. She heard him move into the barn, heard him look at the calves, the way he always looked at them, the slow, methodical attention of a man who counts not because he doesn't trust the number, but because the counting itself matters to him. The whole herd looks like those 7 from March, he said. Yes, she said. He came to stand beside her at the ledger. He looked at the page. Her writing neat and certain, filling the columns his father had started, and he had continued, and she had now made her own. My father would have liked you, he said. She had heard something similar before from him about Clara. This was different. This was about the notebook and the breeding program, and the 3 words in the margin that she had carried with her, like a compass bearing, since the night she'd first read them. She understood the difference between the 2 statements, and she understood what it meant that he made both of them. Your father knew what he was building, she said. He just didn't have enough time. We have time, Cole said. She looked up at him. We do, she said. It was the simplest thing either of them had said to each other in 3 years, and it was also the truest. They had time. The note was paid, and the pasture was rotating, and the herd was carrying the bloodline. Cole's father had spent 12 years trying to establish, and the land that had been stopped was running again, and they had time. Cole put his hand on the open page of the ledger. Not over her writing, beside it. The gesture of a man acknowledging something without interrupting it. Henderson wants to talk to us about a cooperative, he said. Him and 2 other ranchers to the east, pooling bulls for the breeding season. Ruth turned to face him fully. Which bulls? He's heard about the older bull. Wants access to him for 6 weeks in the fall. She was already thinking. What's he offering? Labor, Cole said. His boy and 1 hired hand through the summer fence work, and access to his water rights on the North Creek section when ours runs low in August. She looked at the ledger. She looked at Cole. Tell him yes on the water rights and the labor, she said. Tell him the bull goes to his property only if his cows come here. I'm not moving that animal 6 weeks before breeding season. Cole looked at her with the expression that had replaced the almost smile sometime in the 2nd year. Not almost anything. Real. Direct. The expression of a man who finds the person next to him genuinely surprising in ways that do not diminish with familiarity. I'll tell him, he said. Tell him this week, she said. I want the fence work started before July. He left to find Henderson. Ruth stayed in the barn and finished the ledger entry, and then stood for a moment in the quiet, with the calves moving around her, and the older bull in his stall at the far end, large and calm, and entirely certain of his own significance, which Ruth had always thought was one of his better qualities. She put her hand flat on the page she'd just written. Her father's gesture from the trading post, from the years of watching him close a ledger after a good day's accounting with that single flat-handed acknowledgement. She had not known she'd kept it until she found herself doing it. Some things you carry without knowing. She closed the ledger and went to find her husband. The cooperative Henderson proposed turned into something larger than any of them had anticipated. By the fall of 1891, 4 ranches were sharing breeding stock on a rotation Ruth had designed based on the same principles she'd applied to the Harlan pasture. Not concentrated use, but managed rotation, each bloodline moving through the cooperative in sequence, so no single ranch was dependent on a single animal, and the strongest traits spread across all 4 herds simultaneously. She wrote the rotation schedule in a separate ledger she kept specifically for the cooperative. She attended every meeting the 4 ranchers held, and she was the only woman at every one of them. The first meeting she attended, one of the ranchers to the east, a man named Garrett Heavyset, confident in the way of men who have never been seriously contradicted, had addressed all his questions to Cole. Cole had answered 2 of them, and then said quietly, "Ruth manages the breeding program. You should ask her." Garrett had looked at Ruth with the expression she recognized, the recalibrating expression. The one that meant he was adjusting something he'd assumed without realizing he'd assumed it. She had let him adjust. She had answered his questions directly and without softening them, and by the end of the meeting, Garrett was directing his questions to her without making a production of the change. That was the only kind of progress Ruth trusted, the kind that happened without announcement, that became simply the way things were done, because it was the most efficient path. After that first meeting, riding home in the dark with the stars out hard and cold above the road, Cole said, "You didn't say anything when he kept looking at me." "I was letting him figure it out," she said. "What if he hadn't? Then I would have said something," she said. "But men like Garrett always figure it out eventually. They just need a minute to find the door." Cole was quiet for a moment. "You give people a lot of patience that they don't know you're giving them." She looked at the road ahead. "I give people exactly as much patience as is useful," she said. "Not more." He made the sound that was not quite a laugh, but lived in the same territory. She had stopped trying to catalog it. It was simply the specific sound he made when she said something that surprised him and didn't require a response. The winter of 1892 came in hard. Not as hard as the winter Cole's father had survived, the one that had taken 2/3 of a herd and rewritten the purpose of everything that came after. But hard enough. 3 weeks of sustained cold in January temperatures that dropped before dawn and did not recover until past noon wind that came from the northwest without interruption for 11 days straight. The cooperative ranches lost animals. Garrett lost 9 head. The youngest of the 4 ranchers, a man named Briggs, who had joined them in the spring, lost 14, nearly a quarter of his herd. The Harlan ranch lost 2 animals, both from the oldest remaining bloodline, both past their productive years. Ruth had noted both of them in the fall as likely candidates for culling before winter had not pushed the decision because the timing hadn't been right. She recorded their loss in the ledger with the same even hand she recorded everything else, and noted in the margin that the recommendation for earlier culling should be applied to 3 additional animals before the following winter. Garrett rode out the day after the cold broke. He came to the barn where Ruth was checking the surviving cattle, and he stood in the door with his hat in his hand. "2, he said. "2, she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather lost 40 in a winter like this," he said. "I thought 9 was good. Then I heard your number." "It'll be 0 in another 2 years, Ruth said, "if the breeding program holds." He looked at the cattle. At the calves moving around the older cows, most of them with the deep-chested, broad-shouldered look of the 1888 cross running strong now through 3 generations. "How do you know?" he said. "Because I know what they're bred from," she said. "And I know what that breeding was designed to survive." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "I want to expand the cooperative, bring in 2 more ranches from the South County. There are men down there losing herds every hard winter who don't know what they're losing could be prevented." Ruth looked at him. This was not the man who had addressed all his questions to Cole at the first meeting. This was something else. A man who had watched something work when everything around it was failing and had drawn the correct conclusion. "Write them a letter," she said. "Tell them to come in the spring and bring their calving records. I'll want to see at least 5 years." Garrett nodded. He put his hat back on. He started to leave and then stopped. "Mrs. Harlan," he said. She looked at him. "Cole said once that you read the land," he said. "I didn't know what that meant then." "Do you know now?" she said. "I think you read everything," he said. "Land, cattle, people, records, all of it the same way. Like it's all one thing that's telling you one story if you know how to listen." Ruth considered that. It was more accurate than most descriptions she'd heard of what she did. "That's close enough," she said. He left. She went back to the cattle. That evening, Cole asked what Garrett had wanted. She told him about the expansion. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without interrupting, turning it over. "2 more ranches," he said. "Maybe 3 if the men from the South County bring anyone with them." "That's a significant operation," he said. "Managing breeding rotations across 6 ranches. 7 counting hours," she said. He looked at her. "Are you sure you want to take that on?" She looked at him steadily. "Are you asking because you think it's too much, or because you think I think it's too much?" He thought about it honestly. "The second one," he said. "It's not too much," she said. "It's the point. Your father wanted to breed cattle that could outlast the bad years. 1 ranch outlasting the bad years is useful. 7 ranches outlasting the bad years is something else." "What is it?" She picked up her fork. "It's a county that doesn't lose everything every hard winter," she said. "It's families that stay on their land instead of selling to men like Prescott. It's the work your father started in that notebook, meaning something past this fence line." Cole sat across from her at the table with the 3 chairs, the arrangement that had been 3 chairs now for 4 years. Comfortable and unquestioned. And he looked at her with the expression she had come to understand was the deepest one he had. Not the almost smile. Not the open, undefended look. Something quieter than both of those. The look of a man who is aware in a specific moment of exactly how his life would have gone without the person across the table from him, and is not going to say so because some things are too large for words, and he knows it. "All right," he said. 7 ranches. The cooperative expanded. By 1895, it was 8 ranches. By 1897, 11. Ruth kept a separate ledger for each property cross-referenced with the main rotation schedule she updated every breeding season. She attended every cooperative meeting, and she ran every one of them, not because anyone had formally appointed her, but because she was the person who knew the most and had the clearest answers, and the ranchers had long since stopped pretending otherwise. Garrett's son, who had grown up watching his father defer to Ruth at every cooperative meeting, once asked Cole directly how it had come to be that a woman ran the whole county's breeding program. Cole had considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, and then said, "She was right more often than anyone else. When you find someone like that, you get out of the way." The boy had thought about that. "Is that all it takes?" he said. "Being right consistently is harder than it sounds," Cole said. "Most people can do it once or twice. Ruth does it as a general practice." The story got back to Ruth. She didn't say anything about it, but that evening she made the coffee the way Cole liked it, stronger than she usually made it, and she set it in front of him without comment, and he drank it, and neither of them mentioned why. That was marriage Ruth had come to understand. Not the ceremony, and not the agreement, and not even the shared work. Though the shared work was the largest part of it. It was this, the small, unremarked acknowledgments that added up over years into a language that didn't require words. The coffee made stronger. The stall door latched the way she knew he liked it. The ledger left open to the page he needed without being asked. The 10 minutes given when the shoulder needed rest without making it a thing that had to be named. It was the grammar of 2 people who have learned each other so thoroughly that the learning itself becomes invisible. In the spring of 1900, a man named Callahan rode through from the east and stopped at the ranch to ask directions to the Garrett property. Cole was out on the south rotation, and Ruth was at the fence line running wire on the section that needed replacing before the summer cattle moved through. Callahan pulled up and looked at her. A woman in her early 40s, gray beginning at her temples, working fence with the economical precision of someone for whom this kind of work had long since become automatic, and said, "Excuse me, ma'am, I'm looking for the Harlan Ranch." Ruth set down the wire tool. "You found it," she said. He looked surprised in the small way that men looked surprised when the person they expected to be one thing turned out to be another. "I heard this was the place that started the county breeding cooperative," he said. "It is," she said. "I'm looking to speak with the person who runs it," he said. "You're speaking to her," she said. He took his hat off. He was from a county 2 days east, he said. They were having a hard run 3 consecutive years of difficult calving losses that were starting to force families off their land. He'd heard about the Harlan Cooperative from a man at a cattle sale in Lubbock. He'd heard that the ranches in this county were holding through the hard winters better than anywhere in the surrounding area. He wanted to know how. Ruth looked at him. She looked at the road he'd come from. She thought about $11 and a boarding house debt and a rifle that was her father's, and the word negotiable in a newspaper advertisement that she had read 3 times by lamplight. "Can you stay through supper?" she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Then put your horse in the barn and come inside," she said. "I'll show you the records and you can tell me what you're working with and we'll figure out what can be done." He did. She did. They spent 4 hours at the kitchen table with ledgers spread between them, and Ruth asked questions, and listened to the answers, and wrote things down, and was already thinking. Before he finished talking about what the first 2 years of a corrective breeding program would require, and which of the cooperative bulls could be made available, and how the rotation schedule would need to be adjusted to accommodate a new set of properties 2 days east. Cole came in from the south pasture as the last of the light was going, and found his wife at the table with a stranger and 6 open ledgers, and the particular focused stillness that meant she was 3 steps ahead of a problem that hadn't fully announced itself yet. He hung his hat, poured himself coffee, and sat down at the 3rd chair without interrupting. Callahan looked at him. "Your wife," he said, "is extraordinary." Cole looked at Ruth. She was already writing something, the pencil moving in the steady, deliberate way it moved when she was working out something important, her eyes on the page and her mind somewhere past it. "I know," Cole said. She didn't look up, but something at the corner of her mouth moved, brief and certain. The expression of a woman who has heard something true and is not going to make a ceremony of it. Callahan left the next morning with 2 ledgers worth of notes. A rotation schedule Ruth had written out the night before, and an introduction letter she'd drafted to the 3 cooperative ranchers whose bulls would be most useful to his county's situation. Ruth stood in the yard and watched him ride out. Cole came to stand beside her. They stood together in the morning quiet and watched Callahan get smaller against the road and the land beyond it, the long, flat Texas distance that swallowed everything eventually. "He'll come back," Ruth said. "I know," Cole said. "He'll bring other ranchers with him." "I know that too." She looked at the land. At the south pasture where the summer cattle were moving through the 3rd rotation section in the easy, unhurried way of animals that have enough space and enough grass and no reason to push. At the barn with its straight door and its solid roof. At the addition with its window and its plank floor, the room that had waited 8 feet high for years before getting its roof. The room where they kept the cooperative ledgers, now shelved in order. 11 ranches documented and cross-referenced, and running the breeding program that Cole's father had started in a notebook with no cover and 3 words in the margin. At the grave marker at the western edge of the property, pale in the morning light, standing as it had always stood, part of the place, permanent remembered. "Your father's notebook," Ruth said. "Do you know where it is right now?" "On the shelf in the back room," Cole said. "Where it always is." "Behind the cooperative ledgers." "Behind the cooperative ledgers," he said. She nodded. She had put it there herself carefully in the position she thought it deserved, behind the work it had generated preceding it, the origin of everything that had come after. the cramped, careful handwriting of a man who had lost two-thirds of a herd in a single winter, and decided instead of giving up to understand why and to build something that would not make the same mistake twice. Outlast the bad years. 3 words that had traveled from a dead man's margin note through 9 years of his son's faithful record-keeping into the hands of a woman who had nothing left but a rifle and $11 and enough stubbornness to answer an honest advertisement, and from there into 11 ranches and a county that held its land through hard winters when the counties around it were letting go. Cole put his hand on the small of her back. Not a claim, not a gesture of ownership, just the steady, warm, certain presence of a man who had learned where she was without having to look. "We should get to work," she said. "We should," he agreed. Neither of them moved for another moment. They stood together in the yard of the ranch that had been stopped and was now running, that had been broken and was now whole, that had held grief and had learned to hold something else alongside it without asking the grief to leave. Then Ruth picked up her wire tool from where she'd left it on the fence post and walked toward the east section, and Cole went to get the buckboard for the supply run he'd been putting off since Tuesday, and the morning opened around them the way mornings did on the plains, wide, unhurried, indifferent to the smallness of any one life, and at the same time the only place any life could actually be lived. 30 years after a woman stepped off a stage with a rifle on her shoulder and a canvas sack in her hand, and a driver who didn't wait a traveler passing through stopped his horse at the Harlan fence line and looked at the property spread out before him. He looked at the cattle moving through a rotation pasture in the easy pattern of a well-managed herd. He looked at the barn and the house and the addition with its window and its solid roof. He looked at a woman gray at the temples working a fence line with a hammer and a wire tool, and the absolute unhurried certainty of someone who has been doing this particular work for long enough that every motion has been refined to its most efficient form. Not one gesture wasted. The hammer falling exactly where she intended it to fall. He flagged down an old rancher crossing the yard and asked who owned this place. The old rancher looked at the woman at the fence line. He looked at the traveler. He thought about how to answer a question that simple, which turned out to be not simple at all. "We do," he said finally. The traveler waited for more. "She came in the spring of '87, Cole said, when the place was near done. The note was due in 11 weeks, and I had 31 cattle and a barn door on one hinge and a breeding program I didn't know I was running." He looked at Ruth at her back at the efficient fall of the hammer. "She read 9 years of my father's records in one night and told me what I had before I knew I had it. And she stayed," the traveler said. "She stayed," Cole said. The traveler watched her work for a moment. "Why?" he said. "If it was that bad when she came, why did she stay?" Cole was quiet for a moment. He watched his wife work the fence with the same attention he had always watched her, not the watching of a man observing, but the watching of a man who is still after 30 years learning things. "You'd have to ask her," he said. "But I think it's because she knew what this place was before it knew itself. And she wasn't willing to leave a thing like that unfinished." The traveler tipped his hat and rode on. Ruth had heard it, the voices, the general shape of the conversation, if not the words. She had kept working because the fence section needed finishing before the afternoon wind picked up, and because that had always been her answer to most things. Keep working. Let the work be what it is. She drove the last staple and tested the wire, and it held clean and true. She picked up her tools and turned toward the barn. The land ran out in every direction around her, wide and flat and permanent, and hers every acre of it earned not by inheritance or luck or the grace of anyone's good opinion, but by work and by time, and by the particular stubborn willingness to stay in a place until it became what you could see it was capable of being. She had come with $11 and a rifle and everything else she needed already in her. She had stayed because staying was the right thing to do, and Ruth Calloway Harlan had never in her life walked away from a right thing simply because it was difficult. That was who she was. That was who she had always been. And the land she walked across now in the long light of a late afternoon 30 years from the day she'd first set foot on it knew her name.